Okay, welcome back. We're looking at lesson 18 in Hebrews this week, and we're going to take chapter 12, verses 1 through 12. Now, the writer here is going to tap into kind of a familiar image to most of us. He's going to talk about running like in a foot race. And from the imagery and our understanding of that sport, he's going to give us some lessons about how we can run a race spiritually. Have you ever been involved in running races? I'm not much of a runner. I've done some running, but not for competition. Kind of hate to run. In fact, unless someone is yelling fire or lunch, I tend to not run very much at all. But I got friends that are really into running, and the level of preparation that they'll go to make sure that they can compete well, especially like the marathoners. They may not always be looking at winning the race, coming in first, but they certainly want to finish the race and to do well in the race. And so they'll buy special clothes, special shoes. They'll pay great attention to the kind of nutrition that they eat prior to a race. They'll train with these incredibly detailed and well thought out, planned training regimens. All that just to make sure that they can compete well in the race that they're in. Well, if you can understand that, then you can kind of understand where the writer of Hebrews is going to go in this section. See, he's going to make the point that we are running a race, one that's been marked out for us by Jesus. And he's going to give us some ideas on how we can prepare and how we can compete well, make sure that we finish this race. Let's read chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, and then we'll slow it down, look closely, and see what we can take for application. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And you have forgotten that word of encouragement that addresses you as sons. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes everyone he accepts as a son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you're illegitimate children and not true sons. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, so that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather be healed. Okay, so there's that imagery of running a race. You know, you can't run a race very well if you're carrying baggage and luggage with you, right? And in this very first verse, he mentions two types of things that can get in our way. Did you catch it? He mentions things that hinder and sin that so easily entangles. What's the difference between those two categories? What kind of things can you think of that would fit into them? Well, sin that so easily entangles would be stuff that we know God has put off limits, stuff we know that messes us up and knocks us off course. The word sin itself means to miss the mark. Could you imagine running a race and taking the wrong road? That could not do well, right? But what about things that hinder, things that get in our way? Well, it seems to me that not everything is a sin, right? But not everything is helpful. And there are some things that I can be involved in that may not necessarily be a sin, but aren't going to help me to do well and compete in this race. The author here wants me to be wise about my race in Christ And he wants me not to hang on to baggage that's going to slow me down and get in my way, even if it's not necessarily a sin. What are some things you can think of that might fit into that category? It's not sinful, but it sure ain't helpful. And if you're serious about running this race, how are you going to respond when somebody shows you that you have some baggage that you need to get rid of, that maybe there's something that's slowing you down? How will you respond to that person? It seems to me that person is a real friend. Now, verses 2 and 3, we're told to fix our eyes on Jesus so that you'll not grow weary and lose heart. How does fixing your eyes on Jesus keep you from losing heart and growing weary? Well, what you fix your eyes on becomes your target. It's kind of like your point of reference, and you sort of can compare yourself to it, right? Well, just think about that. If you're not thinking about Jesus and what he endured, you're likely to compare yourself to somebody else. Maybe you might even be comparing yourself to another brother or sister with whom you have fellowship. Well, what if someone else's road seems easier? What if it seems like the wind is at their back and not in their face? What happens then? If you're keeping your eye on a brother or a sister, you could start to resent them, or you could start to whine and feel picked on, or somehow that things aren't fair. But we compare ourselves to Jesus. That's what we're told to do. See, other Christians may not have to go through the very same things that you and I go through. Maybe the race that's been marked out for you is slightly different than the one that's been marked out for me. If you compare yourself to somebody else, there's a good chance you're going to get really weary and lose heart. But if you compare yourself to Jesus and the race that he ran, I think it's pretty hard to feel too picked on. Comparing ourselves to him, fixing our eyes on him, but we really haven't faced that much, have we? Now look at verse 7. In verse 7, what does the writer mean when he says that we must endure hardship as discipline? Well, first of all, do you equate discipline with punishment or with training? See, whenever I first used to read about discipline, I used to always assume it was like when I got hit with a belt as a kid. I was being disciplined, they told me. Well, I think that the way the word is used here specifically implies being trained. If you've ever competed on an athletic team, like maybe played football or something, you go through some really odd and strange drills. I used to box, and the coaches used to have me doing some really bizarre kind of exercises and training. It was discipline, and it was all meant to prepare me for the things that I might face in the game. Troubles, frustration, heartaches, guess what? Those are all a part of God's training process. To endure hardship, you got to embrace it. You can't resist it and you can't resent it. You've got to embrace what hardship actually does for you. Check out what James says in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. There he says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Well, knowing that we all want to be mature and complete, right? And knowing that the troubles that we face, the trials, are what help us to be mature and complete, would you really rather not have any hardship? Would you really choose to avoid it, knowing that it's exactly through hardship that we become mature? See, looking at it like that makes it easier for me to embrace that hardship because I realize that it's paying off, it's taking me someplace. The other thing that I get from this section here is that I should expect hardship. Not just endure it and embrace it, but I should expect it. Check out what Peter says in 1 Peter 4:12. He says there, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the painful trial you're suffering, as though something strange were happening to you." You know, some Christians believe that if you're behaving well, you won't be having any kind of problems or trials, that being obedient avoids hardship. If you've believed that, well, you've believed something really that the Bible does not teach. And the likelihood is that if when you have troubles, the first question you're going to ask is, what did I do wrong? Well, your faith can get really shaken whenever you're surprised by hardship. Hardship isn't always a sign that you've screwed up somewhere. Scripture tells us that hardship is part of God's training process. It's part of the discipline. And God has always used hardship to toughen up his servants. Now, did you catch in here what the author of Hebrews says hardship is actually evidence of? He says that it's evidence that God is accepting us as his children. He says that God is training us and shaping us so that we can share in his holiness. You'll see that in verse 10. And so that we can produce a harvest of righteousness and peace. He says that in verse 11. Now I want to go back to the Old Testament here and show you something and challenge you to think about it. In 1 Kings 6 through 7, there was a record there of some instructions on building the temple of God. It reads this way. In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. Okay, I work with wood, not with stone. Wood is tough enough. I couldn't imagine trying to build a house someplace or build something someplace and not being able to cut the wood at the site where I was using it. These guys were required to shape the stones that they were building the temple with someplace other than at the temple site where they were using it, back at the quarry. That's where all the hammers and chisel and stuff was going on. Why in the world do you think God would have given such a peculiar command to the people who were building that temple? Well, usually whenever God did something in the Old Testament, it was to teach us a lesson that we could apply here and now. And see, I think God cared about where the stones were shaped there because he cares about teaching us that, like living stones, we're being shaped, and we're being shaped here. Check out 1 Peter 2:5. There Peter says, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Did you catch that? You and I are being built into something. We're called living stones. Well, just like those stones that the physical earthly temple was made of, they were shaped at the quarry. Guess where you live? You and I live right now in a quarry. But where we're going, we won't have these kinds of hardships in heaven. The shaping is done here on earth. The shaping is here and now. This is where we're being chiseled on and hammered on and fitted into our spot, into what God is building, into that spiritual house that he's making out of you and me. So we should expect that we're going to go through some hard times. We're going to go through some struggles. And whatever you're facing, whatever tough times come your way, because you're a child of God, because all things work together for good for them that love the Lord. Romans 8:28. Whenever you have those hard times, you're just hearing the sound of a hammer and chisel. God is shaping you. And God's got a purpose through every hardship we endure. He's training us, and he's shaping us, and he's fitting us into something magnificent that he's building. It all has purpose. So what gets in your way? What keeps you from running this race well? What gets in the way of God shaping you? I hope this lesson will challenge you and give you that perspective that allows you to really embrace the things that God brings your way. You're competing. You're running. By his grace, you're going to finish this race. We keep our eyes on Jesus and let God discipline us, change us, shape us, and trim us so that we can be fit into what he's building. Here's some application questions to help you take it just a little deeper. Number one, do you have some baggage that you need to throw off? And if so, what is it? Number two, Whose race do you tend to compare yourself with? Do you ever fall into that habit of comparing yourself to somebody else? Do you keep your eyes fixed on Jesus? Lastly, do hardships discourage you or reassure you? And what do you need to do in order to consider them a pure joy, like we're told there in James? Okay, this can be a challenging lesson, but it makes so much difference in our walk and in our lives and in our ability to compete in this race and to finish it well if we get these concepts down. I know God intends us to be blessed through this. I'll be praying for you, and we'll see you next week.